On a peaceful morning, with sunlight spilling gently through the window and stretching across the warm wooden floor, a scene of quiet happiness unfolded inside a small house in the calm suburbs. Dr. Patricia, a devoted pediatrician, was softly feeding porridge to her little son, Benjamin, while her husband, Dr. Arthur, a neurosurgeon, quietly made coffee in the corner of the kitchen. Amid that tender stillness lay a special presence curled up near the baby's crib, eyes alert yet full of warmth. Max, the retired service dog who had become a loyal, irreplaceable member of their home. Max wasn't like ordinary dogs. Before being adopted, he had spent years serving in the police force, taking on dangerous missions, solving crimes, protecting lives, and even saving victims during high-stakes criminal pursuits. But after a mission went wrong and his partner was seriously injured during a chase, Max was forced into early retirement, a cold punishment for one rare mistake. Since then, he had become withdrawn, reserved, carrying a quiet sorrow in his deep brown eyes. He might have spent the rest of his life in solitude, if not for Patricia. She came to the Animal Rescue Center on a rainy, quiet day, not looking for a service dog, and certainly not expecting to bring home a soul so deeply wounded. But the moment Max looked at her, not with fear, nor with pleading, but with silent waiting, Patricia understood. This dog didn't need a cage. He needed a home. From the day Max entered their lives, Benjamin was still only beginning to roll over. Yet within days, this large, seemingly stern dog had become the tiny child's closest companion. When Benjamin began to take his first steps, Max was never far behind, even using his body to shield the toddler from sharp corners when he fell. When Benjamin cried, Max would sit beside the crib, gently nudging the baby's hand with his nose, until the sobs softened. These scenes became part of daily life for Patricia and Arthur. Parents who could head to work with peace of mind, knowing Max was home, watching over their son. Their days were full of quiet rituals, Patricia reading bedtime stories to Benjamin, Arthur washing dishes, and Max lying beneath the chair, his eyes always fixed on the crib like a silent guardian. They weren't wealthy, but they had everything they needed. Their lives weren't loud, but they were warm. It was the kind of family that seemed untouchable, too perfect to ever break. But life has its ways of testing what feels most whole. As work at the hospital grew more demanding, Patricia and Arthur were forced to find a nanny to help during the hours they were away. That's when Melissa arrived, with her gentle smile, soothing voice, and spotless background check. She appeared like a breeze of cool air on a stifling summer day, instantly putting everyone at ease. Everyone except Max. The moment Melissa crossed the threshold, the fur on Max's back bristled. His eyes turned cold. He stood squarely between her and baby Benjamin, letting out a deep, low bark full of warning. No one paid it much attention, assuming Max was just jealous of a stranger in his space. But Max wasn't jealous. He was sensing something else, something his finely tuned instincts, sharpened by years of training, recognized at once. A threat quietly slipping into the family he had sworn to protect with his life. As the first autumn leaves began to scatter gently across the brick path leading to the house, carrying with them the soft shift of a new season, the family of Dr. Patricia and Dr. Arthur unknowingly stepped into a time of change, one that would quietly mark the beginning of a storm they never saw coming. With their hospital shifts growing more demanding by the day, they were left with no choice but to hire a full-time nanny to care for baby Benjamin while they were away. Neither of them was the type to make decisions lightly, especially Patricia, a mother known for her reason and caution. She spent countless late nights combing through resumes, checking references, and making phone calls to other families. From the long list of names, only one stood out with a resume that seemed almost too perfect to be true. Melissa. Melissa came from a prestigious nanny agency, held official childcare certifications, and had worked with wealthy families across several states. Her recommendation letters were handwritten and full of praise, as if lifted from the pages of an idealized novel about the perfect caregiver. When she arrived for the interview, she wore a crisp white blouse with a rounded collar, her brown hair neatly tied back, soft-soled shoes that made no sound, and subtle makeup framed by a gentle, almost universally likable smile. She spoke with poise, listened attentively, nodded slightly when asked a question, and most notably had a warm, calming voice. Safe was the word Patricia used to describe the feeling she got as she watched Melissa cradle Benjamin for the first time. While everyone else seemed impressed by the young nanny's composure and professionalism, Max, the family's loyal dog, did not share that impression. The moment Melissa stepped across the threshold, Max rose to full attention, his entire body tightening like a drawn bowstring. He didn't bark or lunge, but his gaze locked onto her every move with the unblinking focus of someone watching a potential threat. Patricia chuckled softly, rubbing Max's head as she said, "Don't be jealous, Max. She's just here to help." Melissa bent down and patted his back, but the gesture was mechanical, her smile steady while her hand lacked warmth, like someone mimicking affection from a manual rather than offering it from instinct. In the beginning, Melissa performed her duties flawlessly. She knew the ideal bathwater temperature, how to hold a baby without risking shoulder strain, could sing lullabies in French and Spanish, and even had a clown face routine that made Benjamin giggle within seconds. She kept meticulous logs of feeding times, nap durations, even the color of Benjamin's diaper contents, updating Patricia every evening with clinical precision. Arthur once joked, if Melissa were an app, she'd have a solid 5-star rating. And truthfully, both parents felt relieved to have found someone so seemingly perfect. But sometimes, perfection is its kind of problem. Melissa never slipped, not even for a moment. She didn't scroll on her phone, sneak snacks, sigh from exhaustion, or make even the smallest mistake. Every move felt by the book, like watching someone follow an invisible script line by line. And that exact, robotic precision was what made Max uncomfortable. He began following her everywhere she went, tracking her footsteps with wary eyes. Whenever Melissa was alone with Benjamin, Max would lurk just behind the door, ears perked, body low to the ground, alert and unyielding. Some nights Patricia would hear Max softly barking in his sleep, a sound he hadn't made since the day he was adopted. It was as if something had stirred inside him, a faint but growing sense of danger he couldn't yet define. Melissa, in turn, seemed to realize she was being watched. She started acting more affectionate toward Max, stroking his fur more often, calling him sweet nicknames like Fluffy Bear or My Little Guard Dog. But whenever her back was turned, her eyes would go cold, and Max, with the instincts honed from years of police work, knew that a gentle touch wrapped in sugary words meant nothing on its own. He didn't know what Melissa was hiding, but he was certain of one thing. This woman was not as simple as the smile she wore around others. And in Max's heart, an old command, long buried, began to stir once more. Protect at all costs. Time passed quietly under the comforting illusion of trust that Patricia and Arthur had placed in their new nanny, a trust built on neat appearances, gentle words, and flawless nightly reports that Melissa sent with mechanical precision. They had no idea that each time their car pulled away from the driveway and disappeared around the final bend of the street, the place they called home instantly transformed into a shadowy stage, one where the villain dropped her mask, without audience, without spotlight, with only a speechless child and a dog who couldn't speak the language of humans. When only 3 living souls remained in the house, Melissa's sweetness vanished without a trace. Her transformation was swift and terrifying. The eyes that once seemed modest now turned cold and vacant. The hands that had so carefully brushed baby Benjamin's hair became harsh, rigid, almost metallic. The lullabies from the day before gave way to sharp, hissing whispers through clenched teeth. "Be quiet. Can't you just stop crying? Is that all you do? Eat and cry?" When Benjamin curled up in his crib, lips trembling, eyes wet and wide with fear, Melissa didn't soothe him. Instead, she shoved the bottle's nipple into his mouth so forcefully that milk spilled from both corners of his lips, and her hand held his head, not with care, but like pinning down an object, not a child. There were days when Benjamin was left unfed. Melissa would scowl, swat the bottle aside, and mutter coldly, "You need to learn how to stop on your own." On sweltering summer afternoons, she'd shut the baby in his crib, draw the curtains tightly, put on headphones, and lie back on the sofa, ignoring the hoarse, desperate cries echoing through the house. Sometimes she would pace the room while whispering into her phone, her tone low but urgent, as if planning something. Max had caught fragments of those whispered conversations, sentences like, "Don't worry, I'll get access to their accounts soon. He's too young. No one's going to suspect a thing." And Max, a dog whose eyes had seen more darkness than most, knew this wasn't just cruelty. It was a plan, a calculated, malicious plan. In this script, Benjamin wasn't a child to be loved. He was a tool, a shield, a sweet-faced decoy to gain the trust of parents, to infiltrate their lives, their confidence, and eventually, their bank accounts. Max couldn't speak. He couldn't text, couldn't write a diary, couldn't describe the horror unfolding each day in what had once been a peaceful home. But he had instinct, memory, and more than anything, loyalty that had never wavered. He began growling every time Melissa neared Benjamin, blocking her path with his body whenever he could. One day, when she yanked Benjamin from the crib so roughly that his small arm flushed red in an instant, Max lunged. With a vicious snarl, he sank his teeth into the hem of her skirt. Melissa stepped back, her eyes flashing with fury. But then, like flipping a switch, she plastered on a crooked smile and cooed, Now, Max, I'm just helping. Don't be so aggressive, sweet boy." After that, Melissa started locking Max in the laundry room whenever she was alone in the house. She cornered him behind 4 windowless walls and blasted the radio so loud that no barking could escape. But Max didn't stop fighting. He barked until he was hoarse, clawed at the door until his nails bled. Then, in the silence, he sat, ears alert, eyes damp, listening to the choked sobs of Benjamin from the room next door. Each whimper cut into Max like a blade, a cry from the child he couldn't protect, in the only way that mattered. Patricia and Arthur returned home each evening with smiles, reassured by Melissa's daily summary. Everything went just fine. They had no idea that the moment their footsteps crossed the threshold, Melissa returned to her kind face, gentle hands, and warm voice, while Benjamin, too young to speak, could only express his pain in startled flinches when hands were raised, or in the broken sobs he cried when Max was locked away, leaving him to face the monster alone. Only Max alone, knew the truth, and he understood. If no one else believed him, he would be the first to act. No matter what it took, he would not lose the child he loved more than his own life. And so, across the silent barrier that separated human words from the language of animals, Max began to speak the only way he knew how, with urgent, relentless barking. These weren't the threatening growls of instinct or defense, but cries of desperation, a loyal heart trying with everything it had to reach the ears of the people it loved. Every time Melissa entered Benjamin's room, her steps gentle, her gaze sharp as a blade. Max would bolt toward the door, plant himself firmly in the threshold, and unleash a wave of barking so fierce it rang out like an alarm bell. Sometimes he barked until phlegm caught in his throat, until his voice turned raw and hoarse, but his eyes never wavered. From the trembling child in the crib to the woman wearing a sugary smile that Max had long seen through. At first, Melissa feigned concern. She raised her hands in mock reassurance, cooing softly as though Max were just a spoiled pet having an unexpected tantrum. But when no one else was home, when the house sank into that eerie, fabricated calm, her mask slipped. With each bark, Melissa's eyes narrowed. She bared her teeth and hissed, "Shut up, you stupid mutt!" jabbing her finger at his kennel like a dagger. "Get in there! Who do you think you are, getting in my way?" But Max didn't move. Even as his frame grew gaunt from stress, even as his claws bled from scratching doors in futile protest, he stood his ground before Benjamin like a living shield. His gaze was unwavering, as if to say, "I'm not afraid, and I won't let you touch him again." This resistance only heightened Melissa's tension. She began locking Max up not just when she entered the nursery, but whenever she wanted to roam the house unbothered by that stupid creature staring like some damn judge. She purposely placed his kennel in a hidden corner, behind the laundry room door, dark and stuffy, with no light, no view, a prison that shut him off completely from Benjamin's world. Yet, even caged, Max did not give up. Whenever he heard Melissa's footsteps on the hallway tiles, her sharp muttering behind the nursery door, or Benjamin's sobs rising in painful gasps, Max howled until his voice cracked, clawed until his paws were raw. His eyes burned with a mix of fury and helplessness. It wasn't instinct, it was anguish, a cry from a heart that had learned to feel, to remember, and most of all, to love. A heart that knew without a doubt something was wrong. Danger had passed the point of warning, and was now threatening the very life he had sworn to protect. Sometimes Patricia came home early and heard Max barking non-stop. She'd tilt her head, laugh gently, and say to Arthur, "Maybe Max is just jealous the new nanny works harder than he does." Then move on with her evening, never realizing that the barking wasn't noise. It was a plea, a silent, desperate SOS from a creature who loved too deeply and couldn't make himself understood. Meanwhile, Melissa grew bolder with every passing day. The more she saw that no one suspected a thing, the more ruthless she became. Her voice with Benjamin turned colder, her hands harsher, and her eyes icy like stone. Sometimes she would stand for long moments over the crib, whispering things in a voice so low only Max could hear. But Max had memorized every word. It won't be long now. Then the bank accounts. And when it's over, no one will ever know. Max felt every syllable like a blade, cutting through a mind trained to remember voices, emotions, and the intent behind even the softest phrases. And those words only steeled his resolve. If no one would believe him, then he would bark until someone did, or he would stop it himself, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had left. Darkness is always the easiest place to hide deception, and it was in that quiet stretch of night, when the rest of the world seemed to drift into sleep, that Melissa's true face began to surface. Gone was the gentle smile, the hesitant gaze. In their place emerged the cold detachment of someone methodically carrying out a plan long in the making. At first, Max only sensed that something was off. He couldn't quite explain it. But every night, after Benjamin had fallen into a deep sleep and the living room lights dimmed to a soft glow from the lone table lamp, Melissa wouldn't go to bed like usual. Instead, she would reappear, slim and composed, moving with a quiet precision like someone trained to do this in their sleep. She would slip into a shadowy corner between two bookshelves, where the light didn't quite reach, phone in hand with the screen turned down, and begin whispering. Initially, Max assumed it was a private call. But night after night, at the same time, in the same position, speaking in the same hushed tone, it became clear that this wasn't ordinary conversation. Words that filtered through the door crack: plan, account, medicine, no one suspects, disappear, floated into Max's ears like fragments of something sinister. And to him, they weren't unfamiliar. In his years on the police force, he had spent countless hours listening to officers analyze recordings just like these, midnight whispers cloaked in harmless language but revealing the blueprint of calculated crimes. Now, those sounds returned, not through static speakers or tape reels, but alive, real, and happening right here, in the very house he considered home. From the mouth of the woman who cradled Benjamin daily with hands wrapped in the mask of tenderness. "We don't need to do anything drastic, just a few drops. Nothing fatal, just enough to wear him down, keep him tired. Then we'll blame it on a congenital condition. The doctors won't suspect a thing. I've already got the email password. Next is the banking information. Should be easy. They're far too trusting. Once it's all over, I'll leave the city, same as last time. And remember, don't call during the day. That dog keeps staring at me." The words made Max shudder. Each sentence was a stone tossed into the still pond of this small home, sending ripples that wouldn't easily fade. This wasn't random cruelty. Melissa had a plan, an accomplice, and a clear exit strategy. This wasn't her first act. And now Benjamin, a baby too young to speak, was her newest target. From that moment on, Max no longer slept beside the crib. He kept watch. During the day, he followed Melissa closely, his tail seeming lazy, his head drooped as if dozing, but his eyes never left her movements. At night, he positioned himself in front of the nursery door, lying across the threshold, eyes wide open, ears tuned in, body ready to spring into action at the slightest sound. Whenever Melissa walked past, he would growl, a low, rumbling warning just quiet enough not to wake the baby, but loud enough for her to know. He knew. Melissa soon realized it. She moved more cautiously, closed doors more gently, whispered more faintly, and shielded her phone more carefully. But her eyes, whenever they flicked past Max, were no longer playing pretend. They brimmed with loathing. Sometimes she'd crouch down, lean close to his ear, and hiss, "You think you're smart? You're just a dog. No one's going to believe you." Then she would laugh softly, a warped, icy laugh that echoed like it came from the bottom of some deep, hollow pit. Patricia and Arthur remained completely unaware. They didn't notice the increasingly obvious signs in Max: the exhaustion, the hyper-alert eyes, the tense and protective posture, or the raspy barking late at night. Each time Max tried to tug Patricia's hand with his muzzle toward the nursery, she would just smile, gently pulling away. "You worry too much, Max, sweet boy." No one knew that inside that strong body and loyal heart, Max carried a weight no human was willing, or even able, to bear. But he didn't need them to believe him. He only needed one chance, one moment, to act, to protect, to prove that he had seen what others refused to. That the darkness was creeping closer to the crib each night, and Melissa's smile wasn't for little Benjamin. It was for herself. Her plan was unfolding perfectly, and no one had a clue. No one, except the dog they all thought was silent. The changes in Max's behavior had become too obvious to ignore, not by Patricia or Arthur, who were still clinging to the polished illusion of their perfect home, but by someone else entirely. Someone who once understood Max not through words, but through every tilt of his head, every subtle shift in posture, every silent glance that carried layers of meaning. That person was Doctor Rachel, the former veterinarian and behavioral specialist who had personally worked with Max during his rehabilitation after serving in the force. Rachel had always maintained the habit of checking in on the special dogs she once trained, and Max was one of the rare few who had left a lasting impression, not only because of his service background, but because of his exceptional alertness, resilience, and emotional intelligence. During their most recent checkup, Patricia brought Max in with a casual concern. "He's been a bit irritable lately, barking at night, growling, even scratching the walls. We think it might be stress or just old age." But the moment Rachel looked into Max's eyes, she knew this wasn't age, nor was it ordinary discomfort. It was something else, something deeper, something dangerous. Max didn't greet Rachel with his usual excitement. Instead, his gaze was intense, urgent, like he was trying to communicate something no one else would understand. Rachel gently ran her hand down his spine, checking his heartbeat, breathing, and reflexes. Everything appeared normal, but it was the tension in his muscles, the ears perpetually alert even in silence, and his eyes that refused to leave the doorway behind Patricia that made her pause. She'd seen this before. In dogs that had once been face-to-face with danger, who had sensed the scent of violence, deceit, and danger long before humans ever noticed. And now Max was in that state again. Not for himself, but for something happening inside the home he was meant to protect. Rachel didn't ask many questions. She knew Max couldn't answer, but his behavior was a language in itself. After the appointment, she politely asked Patricia if she could stop by the house to assess whether Max's environment might be affecting him. And Patricia, believing Max was just going through a phase, welcomed her without suspicion. The moment Rachel stepped into the house, something felt off. Everything was neat, pristine, almost staged, too quiet, too perfect, as though the place had been set up for a photo shoot, not for real living. Melissa greeted her with a warm smile and polite charm, offering nothing overtly alarming. But Rachel felt a subtle disconnect, as if a faint, unfamiliar scent hung in the air, not enough to name, but enough to raise her instincts. Max didn't leave Rachel's side for a second. As she approached the nursery, he rushed ahead, blocking the door, then turned back to look at her, eyes pleading. Rachel stepped inside, surveying the space. The crib was perfectly placed. Toys were neatly arranged. The bottle sat on the shelf. Nothing out of order. But when she bent down to gently stroke Benjamin's sleeping cheek, Max let out a soft whine, then began circling the crib, inspecting it like a sentry on patrol. That, combined with the fragmented clues she'd picked up during Max's exam, sent a chill of unease through Rachel's chest. Before leaving, she leaned down and whispered into Max's ear, "I don't know what's happening yet, but I'm not going to leave you alone in this." Then, turning to Patricia, she simply said, "Max is reacting to something. It's not medical. It could be environmental or it could be someone. If you haven't noticed anything unusual, then trust Max. He's never reacted without a reason." Patricia, slightly confused, nodded politely, out of courtesy more than belief. But as Max watched Rachel walk away, something flickered in his eyes. Not joy, but the faint glimmer of hope. In a house where darkness crept closer to Benjamin's crib with each passing night, where Melissa's smile masked intentions far more sinister than anyone suspected. Maybe finally, someone was starting to listen. But just as a flicker of hope had returned to Max's eyes after his encounter with Rachel, in another shadowed corner of what appeared to be a peaceful home, a different kind of tension was quietly building. Not from those who loved, but from the one hiding something darker beneath soft words and a gentle smile. Melissa had begun to realize that Max's behavior was no longer a mere nuisance. It was a threat. The erratic barking, the unblinking eyes following her every move. And now Rachel's presence, who seemed to sense something, made it clear. If Melissa didn't act soon, her plan would begin to unravel. And so, on a morning that looked as ordinary as any other, Patricia having rushed out after a hospital emergency call, Arthur already gone for a long surgery shift, Melissa, calm and composed, stepped into the kitchen to prepare breakfast for Benjamin. But this time, along with a bottle of milk and a glass of juice, she carried a small glass vial. It held a clear, odorless liquid she had discreetly pulled from her crossbody bag, one that no one had ever thought to inspect. With a steady hand and an unreadable expression, she added a few drops to Max's water bowl. Then, as if nothing had happened, she headed to the nursery and began the day with a lullaby, her voice smooth and sweet as silk. Across the hallway, Max began to feel something was wrong. First came dizziness, then sharp cramps in his abdomen. His legs trembled and his breath grew heavy. He tried to stand and walk toward the nursery, but after just a few steps, he collapsed. His legs gave out. Still, Max didn't whine, didn't cry out. He only dragged his weakening body across the floor toward the door of Benjamin's room, where Melissa's cheerful singing rang hollow through the walls. His eyes locked on the gap beneath the door, trying to imprint a final image into memory. The child he had sworn to protect, lying there, unaware of the danger tightening around him like a noose. That afternoon, when Patricia returned home and found Max curled beside the hallway wall, motionless, his eyes dull and unresponsive, panic overtook her. She called Rachel immediately, too shaken to drive. Within 15 minutes, Max was rushed to the animal clinic. Rachel received him with a face so grave it silenced Patricia entirely. After administering emergency meds, fluids, and ordering blood work, Rachel returned to the waiting room. This time she didn't speak softly. Her voice was firm, unflinching. Max was poisoned. Thankfully, the dosage was small, but if you'd waited another hour, he might not have made it. Patricia froze. She scrambled for rational explanations. Maybe Max had eaten something in the yard, maybe it was old water, maybe an insect bite. But Rachel shook her head and laid down the lab results in front of her. She pointed to a foreign compound found in Max's blood. A low-dose sedative, hard to detect without experience, and particularly dangerous to animals. Rachel looked up, her gaze steady, tinged with sorrow. Patricia, I know you trust what's happening in your home, but Max doesn't react like this to people for no reason. I trained him. He only barks when something's wrong. And now someone's trying to silence him. Permanently. That sentence cut through the last layer of doubt in Patricia's mind, like a blade. Every time Max had barked into the night, clawed at the door, blocked Melissa's path, it all came flooding back, clear and urgent like a chain of alarms she had ignored for far too long. She turned toward the treatment room, where Max was now receiving fluids. He still lay, his body weak, but his eyes had opened slightly. The brightness was gone, but deep within them was a glimmer of defiance, as if to say, I'm still here, and I won't let her win. As for Melissa, upon hearing that Max had survived, she offered only one chilling comment. Shame that dog didn't die. I'll have to be more careful next time. As Patricia left the veterinary clinic that afternoon, her heart still tight with the image of Max's dazed eyes and Rachel's grim warning, she thought only of going home, holding her son close, and sitting down with herself to finally make sense of what was happening. But she hadn't even placed her hand on the familiar gate when a voice called out from the other side of the fence, low, gravelly, weathered with time, and made her turn around with a jolt. There stood Mr. George, the reclusive neighbor next door, tall and lean, his eyes deep-set, arms always folded as if out of long habit, a habit shaped by years in law enforcement. Today, though, he didn't greet her with a polite nod or a casual smile like he usually did. He simply said, slowly and plainly, I've known something wasn't right for weeks, and I think it's time to speak up. Patricia froze for a moment, unsure how to process his words. but George stepped off his porch, a worn leather notebook in his hand, the one she often saw him scribbling in while sitting outside, quietly observing the neighborhood. He invited her inside, made tea, and without small talk or preamble, opened the notebook and flipped to the marked pages. What he showed her wasn't speculation. It wasn't a gut feeling. It was data, detailed, time-stamped, and methodically recorded by someone who had once been a detective in child abuse investigations. And it was all about Max. For over a month, George had been watching. He noticed Max's barking came at specific, consistent times, often in the early afternoon, and again at around 3 a.m., when the whole neighborhood was asleep. At first, he thought Max was having sleep issues or was simply aging, but what made him start documenting things was how often Max's barking aligned almost exactly with the sound of a child crying from the nursery window. It wasn't normal crying, George said, his voice tightening. It wasn't hunger or being startled. It was panic. It was pain, and it happened too often. Patricia flipped through the pages with trembling hands. First entry, dated more than 3 weeks ago. 13:10, Max barking aggressively, intermittent crying heard next door. 03:27, soft footsteps stop outside upper window, Max growling non-stop. 12:45, Max put in backyard kennel. 5 minutes later, the loud infant crying resumes. Each line cut into Patricia like a small, precise blade. Every behavior she had once brushed off. Max is jealous. Babies cry, it's normal. Melissa's experienced, she knows what she's doing. Now began to feel like rationalizations wrapped around something far more sinister. George didn't conclude. He simply laid out what he had seen and heard. He explained that, as a former investigator, he'd learned to trust his instincts, especially when backed by careful observation. And Max, he added, wasn't just any dog. He's like an officer who can't speak, George said, voice low, eyes drifting towards the house next door. But if you listen, he'll tell you everything. Patricia clutched the notebook in her hands, Rachel's words from that morning echoing in her mind. Max doesn't act out for no reason. Someone is trying to silence him. And now, with every bark in the night, every growl at Melissa, every pleading look Max gave her when Melissa held her son, those memories replayed in her head like a film in reverse. The scattered pieces finally came together. The image wasn't yet clear, but it was warning her. George didn't press her for a response. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder and said, gently but firmly, "If you're starting to doubt, don't wait for proof. Because when the proof finally comes, it might already be too late." His words weren't dramatic. They were the quiet truth of someone who had seen too many tragedies unfold after hesitation. And as Patricia stepped out of George's house, the notebook still in her hand, her heart pounded harder than ever. Not from fear, but from something else. For the first time, after days of silence and denial, she had a reason to question. And this time, she wouldn't turn away. And at the very moment Patricia clutched the notebook in her hands, her heart tightening with confusion and guilt after the conversation with Mr. George, somewhere not far from there, a living creature was pushing past its final limit, struggling with every step, quietly making its way home, as if trying to fulfill an unfinished promise. Max, still not fully recovered after the dangerous poisoning, his body weakened by detox medications and lingering injuries, was using the last of his strength to escape the veterinary recovery ward, where he had been under the careful supervision of Dr. Rachel. No one knew how Max managed to slip through the safety gate, navigate through narrow alleys, cross busy streets and blaring horns, just to find his way back to the only place that truly mattered. The familiar scent of the front steps, the breeze slipping through the curtains, and most importantly, the baby he loved. The baby Max instinctively knew was in real danger if no one intervened in time. Though his body ached, his fur matted and his breath labored, his eyes burned with a single, unwavering message. I must get there. I must protect Benjamin. As Max silently slipped through the backyard gate, dusk had just begun to fall, and the last rays of sunlight were fading behind the rooftops. Inside, Melissa stood in the kitchen, her posture rigid, eyes void of emotion, and her expression cold and focused. She wore an apron and softly hummed a lullaby, but anyone listening closely would hear that it wasn't soothing. It was mechanical, detached, like the ticking of a countdown clock. On the counter, a freshly prepared bottle of milk still let off a faint trail of steam, and beside it, a small brown medicine bottle with no label, recently taken from the bottom of her handbag. The item Melissa guarded as if it were a treasure. One drop at a time, the clear, odorless liquid fell into the bottle. Subtle, invisible, leaving no trace, but potent enough to weaken a baby's immune system. This wasn't her first time. Her calm precision, the way she calculated the dosage, showed experience. She wasn't just harming a child, she was crafting a scenario where worried parents would be too frantic, too overwhelmed to notice anything beyond vague symptoms. While they raced from one doctor to another, Melissa would gain unrestricted access to accounts, private documents, and every corner of their home life. A flawless plan, until a bark shattered the silence like a thunderclap. That bark wasn't just a reaction, it was a cry, a warning, the final call of a creature that never gave up. It came from the back door, echoing through the hallway, vibrating off the walls like a tolling bell. Max burst in with all the force he had left. No hesitation, no fear. Legs that had struggled moments ago now moved with fierce purpose, and eyes bloodshot from exhaustion burned with fury, determination, and love. He lunged and knocked the bottle from Melissa's hands just before the last drop fell in. The bottle crashed against the wall, shattering into pieces, milk and poison splattering across the floor, a vivid testimony to the crime that had almost been completed. Melissa stumbled back, pale-faced and trembling. The rage and fear in her eyes betrayed her completely. Gone was the gentle nanny mask. She was now fully exposed. She looked at Max like one looks at a nightmare come alive, screaming in disbelief. How did you get back?" Max stood firm between her and the crib, fur bristling, growling low and unrelenting. His stance was not for praise, not for show. It was pure instinct, a living shield ready to die if needed to keep Benjamin safe. At that moment, the front door swung open and Patricia stepped inside, still stunned from her visit to Mr. George's home. The notebook was still clutched in her hand, but her eyes immediately locked onto the scene before her, the broken bottle on the floor, Max standing guard before the crib, and Melissa, white as a sheet, hand shaking, still clutching the small brown bottle. Everything unraveled in a heartbeat. But it was enough. Enough for Patricia to realize that her suspicions weren't just right. They had come far too late. She barely had time to react before Max barked again, this time not as a warning, but as a verdict. Just as the air in the house was still thick with tension after Max's final bark. Patricia frozen in place, staring at the shattered bottle on the floor, Melissa still clutching the brown vial behind her back, and baby Benjamin wide-eyed in fright from the noise. A sudden doorbell rang, snapping them all back to reality. Melissa flinched, hastily hiding the vial behind her in a rare moment of clumsy panic, while Patricia, still dazed by what she'd just witnessed, hesitated a second before walking toward the door, her face clouded with confusion and suspicion. As she opened the door, a cheerful voice rang out, "Aunt Pat, where's Max?" It was Bella, Patricia's young niece, bounding into the house, followed closely by Alice, her older sister carrying a basket of pastries, and wearing her usual gentle smile. The moment Alice stepped inside, she sensed something was off. There was no soft music playing, no lavender scent that usually filled Patricia's home every afternoon. And most telling of all, Melissa's face was pale as paper, her eyes darting nervously, her hands stiff and hidden behind her back. Patricia tried to keep composed, but Max, having made sure Benjamin was safe, immediately turned and slowly walked toward Bella. His body trembled with exhaustion, yet his eyes were calm, as if he had just found an ally in the chaos. He gently licked Bella's wrist and rubbed his head against her leg, not with the usual excitement, but like he was sending a quiet message. "I need your help." Bella, an intuitive child with a special bond to Max from past visits, immediately sensed that something wasn't right. She knelt and whispered, "What's wrong, Max?" The dog lifted his head, locked eyes with her, then turned and walked towards the kitchen, toward the table where the brown vial had only been half hidden under the tablecloth. Max stopped, growled softly, and looked back at her as if saying, "Look closely. It's there." Bella blinked, glanced toward the edge of the tablecloth, and began to approach, just as Melissa stepped in sharply, her voice unusually harsh. "Be careful, Bella. That spot's dirty." The words came too fast, too sharp, like a whip. Both Alice and Patricia turned instantly, and it was that slip, too quick, too anxious, that cracked the perfect mask Melissa had worn for so long. Alice, calm yet deeply perceptive, immediately picked up on it. She placed the basket on the table and stepped fully into the kitchen, her eyes scanning everything. The spilled milk still on the floor, the sharp glass shards that hadn't been cleaned up, and Melissa's avoidant gaze. Bella leaned in close to Max, stroking his head and whispering, "Is it that bottle?" She pointed toward the edge of the cloth, now slightly lifted, revealing a sliver of the dark brown vial. Max let out a low growl, then licked Bella's hand again, as if to confirm. Patricia could no longer pretend. She stepped forward, yanked the tablecloth away, and the bottle rolled onto the floor, bouncing once before landing at Max's paws. Melissa lunged to grab it, but Max jumped forward, baring his teeth in a fierce growl that froze her in her tracks, her hand recoiling in fear. Alice didn't need to ask another word. One look, and she knew her sister had put her trust in the wrong person. Patricia bent down to pick up the vial, her fingers trembling, but her eyes were different now, no longer clouded with doubt or hesitation, but sharp and clear with understanding. In that stifling kitchen, only Max's low growl and the pounding of 3 startled hearts could be heard. And at that moment, they finally saw what they had missed for too long. Evil doesn't always wear a terrifying face. Sometimes it smiles sweetly and speaks softly, with the voice of someone trusted to protect the most precious thing of all, a child. In the middle of the kitchen, where tension hung heavy in the air, where the shattered vial at Max's feet felt like truth itself spilled across the floor, and where Patricia's eyes had lost all hesitation while Melissa's showed fear for the first time, something seemingly small opened the door to a far more horrifying truth. It happened when Bella, the little girl who had been quietly standing beside Max, wide-eyed in the storm of adult confrontation, tilted her head and caught sight of something. A corner of the cream tablecloth had slipped out of place, revealing the edge of a slim, moss-green notebook, bulging slightly, as though what lay within was more than paper. Perhaps secrets long hidden from the light. Without a word, Bella bent down gently, slowly pulling the notebook from its hiding place. Her movements were soft enough that Melissa, still fixated on Max's growling eyes, didn't notice. As Bella lifted the book, Max let out a low growl and licked her wrist, as if confirming, "What you found matters." Patricia and Alice turned at once when Bella asked, in a clear and innocent voice, "Aunt Pat, whose notebook is this? It was hidden under the table." The child's voice was pure, unassuming, but it struck the room like a second alarm bell, following Max's growl, pushing the villain one step closer to the edge. Patricia moved quickly, taking the notebook from Bella's hands. As she opened it, her fingers began to tremble. Not from fear, but from a visceral knowing that whatever she was about to read would change everything. And it did. The first page alone brought the air in the kitchen to a standstill. Target acquisition plan, doctors. Patricia and Arthur, phase completion, week 5. The handwriting was tidy, deliberate, inked in even blue strokes. The pages that followed listed their daily routines, work schedules, return times, off days, and disturbingly specific personal details, Wi-Fi passwords, garage codes, names of doctors at the hospital where Patricia and Arthur worked. But the real horror lay midway through the notebook. Bank account numbers, projected withdrawal amounts, notes like increase dosage weekly, simulate illness, reaction protocol if suspicion arises. It read like a criminal blueprint, laid out with no fear of discovery, as though Melissa had believed she was in complete control of this house, of everyone in it. Patricia turned page after page, her vision swimming. The numbers, the neat handwriting, the calm phrasing, they all slashed through her trust like 1,000 paper cuts. Each line exposed how deeply she'd been manipulated by the woman standing only a few feet away. Alice stepped forward and yanked a loose sheet tucked into the middle of the book. Her eyes scanned it before she looked at her sister, her voice sharp and shaking with fury. She even marked a planned move-out date right under the line that says, "Child's condition noticeably weaker." Patricia, she was planning to kill your son, slowly, and leave with everything you own. Patricia didn't reply. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes had already shifted, no longer confused, afraid. What stood there now was a mother fully awakened, betrayed to her core by the enemy she had once welcomed in with open arms. Melissa froze for just a moment, but then snapped. Like an animal backed into a corner, she lunged for the notebook, eyes wild, her hand reaching as if grabbing it could somehow erase everything. "Give it to me! You have no right to read that!" she shrieked, her voice ragged, the mask of composure finally, completely gone. But before her hand could touch the notebook, Max moved, faster than rage, faster than fear. Though weakened, his body launched forward, slamming into Melissa with full force. He drove her back, then stood between her and the others, shoulders squared, teeth bared, growling with a sound that shook the floor. His eyes never blinked. Melissa stumbled back, her face twisted with panic. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her hand stayed frozen mid-air, reaching, but too afraid to advance. She stared at Max, the very dog she had poisoned, with a mix of terror, disbelief, and hopelessness. And Max stood like a sentinel, a silent guardian, his body tense but steady, his eyes fierce and unwavering, as if to say, "I knew from the beginning, and I won't let you hurt them ever again." In that suffocating silence, all that could be heard was Max's growl, Patricia's quickening breath, and the rustling of the notebook pages soaked in a darkness that now lay fully exposed. There was nowhere left to hide. And Melissa knew she had lost. But what no one expected was that she wasn't done fighting. As Melissa backed away, cornered in the kitchen with nowhere left to hide, and the notebook exposing her crimes lying open on the table beneath Patricia and Alice's stunned stares, a quiet but critical event was unfolding behind the chaos. Bella, though just a grade schooler, had understood from the very first moment Max looked at her, not just looked, but pleaded, that something serious was happening, something she could no longer ignore by standing still like a child. Max couldn't speak, but he had warned them in every way he knew how. And if no one else would listen, Bella would be the first to truly hear him. That's why, When Melissa's voice began to crack and rise in angry panic, Bella silently reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her school-issued phone, and slid the recorder on. She tucked it deep into her soft fleece lining. She couldn't remember every word the adults were saying, but she knew if Melissa had done something terrible, she'd say it herself when her mask slipped. And Max, as if sensing Bella's plan, never took his eyes off her, his body language calm and steady, like a silent guide through the storm. A few minutes later, as the tension shifted to the documents on the table, and the room fell into uneasy quiet, Max let out a low growl, then turned and padded down the hallway. He looked over his shoulder at Bella, a subtle beckon. She hesitated, glanced at her mom and aunt, both absorbed in reading, and then quietly followed. Max led her down the narrow corridor towards the back entrance, an area where Bella vaguely remembered seeing Melissa lurking around at night, always on the phone, always whispering with her back turned. And Max was always behind her, watching, silent. He stopped beside a low shelf near the laundry machine and scratched gently at a wooden panel. Bella knelt, ran her fingers along a narrow crack, and discovered a thin black cloth pouch wedged between two boards. Inside were a silver USB stick and a micro SD card wrapped in tape. Bella's eyes widened. She looked at Max, who stared back with silent urgency. She tucked both items into her coat pocket, the recorder still rolling. But Max wasn't finished. He nudged her toward the space beneath the stairs, a cluttered nook used for cleaning supplies. He stretched up, growled softly, and motioned toward a battered mop bucket. Bella approached, peeled back the cloth covering it, dug into the bottom, and found a small Ziploc bag containing several printed pages, scanned fake IDs, caregiver certifications, and 3 samples of different signatures. It was a hidden stash, temporary but telling. And Bella, raised by a mother who had always taught her the importance of writing things down, understood. This was evidence. Her job now was to protect it until the adults were ready to act. When she returned to the living room, she said nothing. Her face gave away little, but her eyes had changed. Bella was no longer a passive observer in this story. She was a living witness, a keeper of proof, and, most importantly, the first to truly listen to Max without doubt or delay. Inside her coat now was over 10 minutes of audio, filled with Melissa's frantic whispers. "I should have left earlier. They're starting to catch on. If they find out I was exposed, I'm done." Every word recorded, every second preserved. Max, still breathing heavily, his body worn and marked from the poison, stayed close to Bella. He lay down by her feet, gaze locked on Melissa, ears tuned to the faintest sound. And when Patricia asked suddenly, "Who gave you those drugs? Who gave you access to our accounts?" Melissa didn't answer. Instead, her eyes flicked sideways, toward a shadowed corner of the room, as if afraid someone might be watching. Bella, watching her closely, leaned down and whispered to Max, "I don't think she did this alone. Do you?" Max didn't growl. He didn't lick her hand. Instead, he lowered his gaze, then raised it again, locking eyes with hers. And in that quiet, fierce look, Bella felt the answer. Yes, there's something else. Something bigger. And it's still out there, just behind the next door. Just as the first pieces of evidence were quietly passed from Max and Bella into Patricia's hands, and Melissa's secret notebook was finally opened to daylight, the entire house shifted into a state of sharp alert. No more confusion between doubt and trust. No more gray zones between kindness and deceit. But just when everyone thought they had uncovered the heart of the truth, Max, guided by an instinct that had never once failed him, grew restless again. He refused to lie down and rest as any poisoned dog recovering should, and instead began scratching at the floor, growling lowly, then trotting quickly toward the staircase that led to the second floor. Toward Benjamin's room, still softly lit by a warm bedside lamp. Patricia, still shaken from the string of revelations, assumed Max merely wanted to check on the baby. But the moment she opened the door, Max bolted to the crib's corner, where the largest teddy bear was propped up against the wall as always, and began furiously clawing at its stomach. At first it was just a few tentative scrapes. Then his sharp claws tore into the plush fabric, sending tufts of white stuffing flying like snowflakes. Bella gasped, her voice a sharp whisper. "Max, stop! That's Benjamin's teddy!" She moved to pull him back, but Patricia raised a hand, stopping her. There was something in Max's behavior, something urgent, that made her pause. Alice had just entered the room, too, her eyes scanning the space with focused intensity. Max didn't stop. He dug deeper, using both his paws and his muzzle to rip through the teddy bear's middle, until finally a small object tumbled free. It wasn't stuffing. It was a miniature surveillance camera, expertly hidden between layers of lining and synthetic padding, wired to a wafer-thin battery sealed in a heat-insulated plastic pouch. The room fell silent. Patricia stepped forward, slowly picking up the device from the disemboweled toy's belly. Her hands trembled as she turned it over, staring into the tiny, cold black lens, aimed directly at the crib where Benjamin slept each night. "This is a camera?" Alice murmured, her voice heavy with shock. Patricia didn't answer. Her expression had hardened. She tilted the device, spotting a small infrared light tucked into the side. Night vision capable, stealthy, with no blinking indicator. It didn't transmit. It stored footage locally. Whoever planted it would need to retrieve it themselves. All three women turned toward the stairs, where Melissa had been standing silently near the bookshelf this whole time, not saying a word. Her stillness wasn't composed. It was calculating. Bella's small hand tightened around Max's paw. She leaned down and whispered, "Thank you. You knew before any of us." Max let out a low, soft whine, not in pain but like a reassurance. He looked at the crib, then at the camera, as if to say, "No one is going to hurt me again." Patricia clenched the camera in her hand, fury rising in her chest. Not just anger, but betrayal that cut to the bone. Someone she had trusted to care for her son, day and night, had planted a hidden camera in his bedroom. Someone had watched her baby turn in his sleep, cry out in the dark, all in moments that were supposed to be sacred, private, a mother's moments. "You watched my son every night?" Patricia's voice dropped to a low growl as she turned toward Melissa. "What did you do with those recordings?" Melissa said nothing. Her eyes flickered, panicked now, no longer capable of hiding. When Alice descended the stairs holding the camera, its tampered casing still obvious, Melissa's expression finally cracked. She didn't speak. She clenched her fists, backed away slightly, scanning for an escape route. Max, still standing at the top of the stairs, growled deep in his chest, his body coiled like a drawn bow, ready to spring if she so much as twitched toward the door. The teddy bear lay limp on the floor now, its belly torn open like a symbol of truth, finally laid bare. A child, an innocent, speechless child, had been watched, night after night, in the very room meant to protect him. And if it hadn't been for Max, if it hadn't been for the quiet loyalty and heightened instincts of an aging dog dismissed by many as past his prime, how much longer would they have lived in that illusion? After the hidden camera was discovered inside the teddy bear, and the flicker of panic in Melissa's eyes unwittingly confirmed every fear Patricia had ever buried, the decision was made to split up and sweep the house. While Alice took Bella back to the living room to rest and stay safe, Patricia headed downstairs, phone in hand, calling one person she knew wouldn't sit still after hearing what had happened. Mr. George. Max walked at her side, no longer aggressive, but not letting down his guard for a second. He moved like a silent bodyguard, his eyes constantly tracking Melissa, who now sat hunched in a corner, her gaze darting around the room, clearly searching for one last crack to slip through. Minutes later, George appeared at the front door, his posture steady, eyes sharp with the instincts of someone who had solved more than his share of cases. In his hand, he carried the old leather notebook filled with logs of Max's unusual behavior, nights of childlike cries, and the mysterious footsteps at odd hours. As he stepped into the house, the atmosphere thickened, as though the truth itself had just walked in with him. Patricia didn't speak. She placed the tiny camera on the table, still warm from being pulled out of the stuffed toy, and beside it, Melissa's incriminating notebook. Then she looked at George as if to say, "It's time?" George leaned over, examining the camera, his face darkening as he took it in. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and opened his Notes app. He read aloud a timeline. Intense barking, 3:12 a.m., child crying prolonged, 3:14, light footsteps upstairs, 3:17. Then, slowly lifting his eyes to Melissa, who had now stood, her face pale and trembling, he nodded and said evenly, "I heard everything. For weeks. But I didn't have enough to act. Now I do." Patricia stepped closer, placing a hand on Max's shoulder. He remained by her side, his eyes locked on Melissa. This wasn't mere alertness. It was protection, a silent vow that the truth, at last, had its witnesses and the evidence to back it up. At that very moment, a piercing cry echoed from the nursery. "Benjamin." Patricia flinched and raced up the stairs, Max bolting beside her. Melissa froze in place, as if awakened from a trance, then shouted, "It wasn't me. I didn't do anything. He's just fussy." But in a house already soaked in suspicion and undeniable truths, her words landed like hollow excuses. Patricia swept Benjamin into her arms, soothing him with familiar whispers. Max circled the crib, nose twitching, until his eyes narrowed, and he let out a low growl, a warning. Something had been near the child that shouldn't have been. When Patricia returned downstairs, still cradling Benjamin, his hiccuped sobs fading, she found George standing like a wall across the hallway. His expression had shifted fully into that of a man who had issued judgment in far too many painful cases. Firm-focused, unshakable. "Ms. Melissa," he said, voice steady as iron, "I need you to sit down. Do not move. The police are on their way. I will not allow you to hurt anyone else." Melissa recoiled, ready to protest. But then she met Patricia's eyes. The same eyes that once welcomed her into this home now burned like wildfire. She said nothing. From behind, Alice stepped forward, phone still in hand. "I called the police. They told me to keep you here and protect the evidence." She moved to the table and added 2 more zip bags. Bella's discoveries. The USB, the micro SD, the forged IDs, the camera from the teddy bear, Melissa's notebook. All lined up like an indictment that needed no jury. Melissa slowly sat down, her whole body trembling, eyes scanning the room like someone who finally understood. There was no escape. No one was left to cover her tracks. Max moved closer, settling at Patricia's feet, his stare fixed on Melissa. He didn't bark. He didn't move. His very presence was warning enough. George quietly wrote the final lines in his notebook. Then he closed it with purpose and said, in a voice like a gavel crashing in a courtroom, "You've been found out, and this time, no one's cleaning up your mess." After the intense confrontation and George's timely intervention, it seemed, for a brief moment, that everything was under control. Melissa remained seated in the living room, seemingly subdued, while the evidence was laid out in full view. The detailed notebook, the camera hidden inside the teddy bear, the USB stick and memory card that Bella and Max had uncovered. The police had been called, and while Patricia and Alice focused on calming Benjamin, who had already endured more than enough for one day, Melissa sat still, silent, looking every bit like someone who had finally given up. But that was only the last mask. In a brief lapse of attention, George stepping outside to take a call from a detective contact, Alice ducking into the kitchen to get water for Bella, Melissa moved. Her eyes, cold and calculating, didn't hesitate. She slipped quietly down the hallway and into Patricia's home office, where the family laptop was still open, its screen glowing. No sound, no words, just a single calculated step forward in a plan that had never truly ended. From her sleeve, she pulled out a silver USB, nearly identical to the one Bella had found. Melissa had planned this. She had deliberately planted the real one as bait, fully aware that the most dangerous evidence wasn't what could be touched or seen, but what lived in the digital shadows. Hidden camera footage, internal logs, and encrypted folders she had been secretly compiling for weeks. And now, if she couldn't escape physically, she would erase every trace. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the fluidity of someone who'd done this many times before. Not a nanny, but a technician of concealment. She launched the control panel for the home's internal camera system, which she'd covertly installed weeks ago. Then, she opened a hidden folder disguised as vaccination schedule. Inside were dozens of files, clips showing her slipping medication into bottles, carrying Benjamin out of sight to do things no one should ever imagine. Melissa didn't hesitate. She selected all, executed a permanent delete, bypassing the trash bin, erasing them directly from the drive. The screen blinked once, and just like that, it was gone. The folder vanished, and the interface reset to its default. She leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly, her eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. She believed she'd outsmarted them, that when the police arrived, the only evidence remaining would be physical. Just some pages, a camera, and the testimony of a dog. But what Melissa didn't know was that even before she entered the room, Alice, always alert to unusual behavior, had discreetly placed her phone on the bookshelf across from the desk. The camera had been rolling ever since Patricia left the room to care for Benjamin. That phone recorded everything. Melissa stepping inside, plugging in the USB, executing the data deletion commands, and finally, that triumphant look she gave the empty screen. It captured not only the images but the sound as well, the keystrokes, the faint whisper as she muttered to herself, "Done. Nothing left to charge me with." When Alice returned, she said nothing. She simply walked over to the desk, retrieved her phone, saved the 4-minute video into a private folder, and without a word, showed it to George and Patricia. Neither of them could speak. On the screen, it was all crystal clear, every key pressed, every deletion command typed in, each file name vanishing one by one. Cam Nursery Night 4.mp4, Audio 1225 hidden.mkv. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This wasn't just an accusation. It was evidence, in image, in sound, and in truth, that could no longer be denied. By the time the police arrived, Melissa was still calmly seated in the living room, her face composed as if nothing had happened. But just minutes later, when Alice's phone was connected to the large screen brought in by the investigation team, and the footage of Melissa erasing the files began to play, the atmosphere in the house shifted completely. One young officer stepped forward and retrieved the USB from Melissa's coat pocket. After checking the serial number, he confirmed it was a dummy. A blank device, a decoy meant to mislead. Melissa froze. For the first time, real confusion and fear flickered in her eyes. She opened her mouth, trying to speak, trying to defend herself, but the video kept playing. And then, her voice echoed through the room, cold and incriminating. "Just erase everything. No one can charge me now. Those idiots don't know about the backup system anyway." George remained still, hands folded behind his back, and his voice dropped, low, heavy, final. "You're clever, but not more clever than someone who spent 15 years tracking cybercriminals." Patricia looked at Melissa, not with anger, but with chilling calm, the kind of quiet disappointment that cuts deeper than rage. "You didn't just try to hurt my son. You tried to erase every trace of it, like you were never even here." And Max, still sitting faithfully beside Bella, let out one low, steady growl. Not loud, not aggressive, just a final sound. One last message for the person who had committed a crime that loyalty itself could never forgive. Just as the footage of Melissa deleting files from the decoy USB drive played before the investigation team, and Patricia's cold, unyielding stare crushed any last chance for Melissa to deny her guilt, it seemed like the household had finally turned the page, a chapter of deception giving way to the light of truth. But what no one expected was that, at the very moment evidence was being sealed and officers were finalizing Melissa's temporary custody paperwork, a stranger appeared at the gate. Tall and lean, wearing a charcoal gray coat, the woman carried nothing but a simple folder of documents and a look of profound tension in her eyes. She didn't knock. She simply stood there, waiting, until one of the security officers noticed her and, recognizing her face from somewhere, rushed back inside to alert the lead investigator. "We have someone here. She's turning herself in. Says her name is Clara." Clara, first mentioned by Melissa in a voice recording that Bella had accidentally captured while following Max in their search for evidence. In the clip, Melissa's voice had been steady, almost smug. "You have no idea. What I'm doing here is just the tip of the iceberg. Clara used to work up north. She's been reassigned. She knows everything. But Clara will never talk." And yet here she was, standing at the doorstep of the very house where everything had begun to unravel. When invited into the living room, Clara never once looked at Melissa, who was being held in a separate room and whose eyes had turned to stone upon seeing her old acquaintance. Instead, Clara fixed her gaze on the police chief, calmly opened her folder, and began laying out documents, records, and forged contracts, each one bearing familiar names from the childcare industry. Her voice was even and composed, but each word landed like a blade. "I was part of the system, one of the operatives trained to play the perfect nanny. We were taught how to speak, how to behave in front of parents, even how to mimic emotion, memorize routines. It was all part of the curriculum. They called it the Early Childhood Companion Program, but in reality, it was financial espionage training." The room fell silent. Clara didn't flinch under anyone's gaze. She continued, her hand tapping the documents. "These are copies of the credentials Melissa used, but those names aren't hers, just like mine wasn't. I worked under the name Julia Reed in another state. The organization behind this provided us with false identities, medical certifications, and even surveillance systems to install in homes. The targets were always the same: wealthy families, especially medical professionals, people with long working hours and unwavering trust in their nannies." Patricia froze. Every detail Clara spoke matched her and Arthur's life over the past year. Blind trust, long hospital shifts, and a nanny who had seemed too perfect to ever question. George, standing nearby, gave a solemn nod, his once vague suspicions now fully confirmed. Then Clara presented her final piece of evidence, a coded list of addresses the organization had infiltrated, complete with handlers assigned to each region. She pointed to one line, looked straight at the lead investigator, and said, "Melissa was just one branch." She oversaw the central region. I used to run the northern division. And the West Coast group, as far as I know, is responsible for at least 2 unresolved child fatalities. Slowly, she turned to look at Melissa, still under guard in the corner, her eyes no longer filled with bitterness, but with exhaustion. I've lived with guilt every night, but when I heard that a child nearly died because of her plan, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Melissa's voice cracked as she screamed from across the room, her composure finally shattered. You betrayed them! You think they'll let you live after this? But Clara didn't respond. She turned back to the police chief, her voice unwavering. I'll take witness protection, but in exchange, I'll take you to the Central Archive, the place where the organization's entire database is still hidden. After Clara agreed to cooperate and disclose the location of the secret data storage tied to the fake nanny syndicate, hope seemed to flicker through the house like a long-awaited dawn. The investigative team sprang into action, swiftly coordinating a raid on the site Clara had revealed, a facility disguised as a child development training center on the outskirts of town. It was a breakthrough that could potentially shake the core of a vast, organized criminal operation. But just as momentum surged and plans aligned, Max, the ever-loyal dog who had silently witnessed every turn of the case, made a sudden move that brought the entire room to a halt. When Officer Reynolds entered the study to recheck the surveillance footage, Reynolds, who had appeared diligent from the very beginning, who had led evidence collection, and was the first to greet Clara when she turned herself in. Max sprang up from where he lay. He didn't bark or lunge. Instead, he stood completely still, his body taut as wire, ears pricked, eyes fixed on Reynolds with the intensity of someone who had just identified a familiar danger. At first, Patricia assumed Max was simply on edge after all the recent chaos, but the dog's gaze never wavered. Every time Reynolds took a step, Max matched it, almost like he was guarding something or someone. Clara, seated quietly in the corner, suddenly turned sharply toward Reynolds. Her eyes narrowed as recognition flared. "What's your name?" she asked, voice low but steady. Reynolds paused, furrowed his brow. "Officer Derek Reynolds. I'm part of the Southern District Criminal Task Force." But Clara didn't blink. Her voice lowered into something closer to a verdict. "I've seen you before. At the training camp in San Jose. You were with Klein, the one who handled suspected defectors." The temperature in the room dropped. Reynolds flinched ever so slightly, then quickly recovered, chuckling dismissively. "You're mistaken." But George, standing quietly at Clara's side, stepped forward, pulled out his phone, and tapped into the internal law enforcement records. Within seconds, he turned the screen to the lead officer. There it was. Reynolds' profile and a suspended internal affairs investigation from 2019 involving a missing child case in Nevada. He had been reinstated due to insufficient evidence. Patricia took a step back, her face hardening. In that moment, the truth landed like a slap. The man they'd trusted to secure the scene, the one who had full access to technical systems, was the most deeply embedded link of all. Max didn't growl. He just stood, unwavering, between Reynolds and the desk, protecting something Reynolds had come to retrieve before fleeing. Realizing he'd been exposed, Reynolds made a sudden motion toward his phone. But George was quicker. He locked his grip around Reynolds' wrist and slammed it to the desk. Trained officers surged forward, weapons drawn in precise formation. In less than 10 seconds, Reynolds was disarmed, cuffed, and escorted toward the waiting agent vehicle. Clara watched in silence. Then she spoke. Quiet, cutting. "I warned you. They didn't just recruit fake nannies. They planted operatives inside the police, the healthcare system, even public service departments." The room fell into stunned silence. What they had thought was a rogue operation, a single fracture in an otherwise secure system, was now revealed to be a sprawling network, its reach extending into institutions once seen as the very pillars of safety and justice. And at the heart of this revelation, it wasn't a detective, a whistleblower, or a lawyer who first uncovered the truth. It was Max, a creature without voice or title, but with unwavering instincts and loyalty sharp enough to unmask a predator in uniform. After the undercover officer Reynolds was unmasked, the tension in the house, which had already felt suffocating, grew even heavier, as if shadows were peeling away from every wall, every corner once believed to be safe. But just as Clara revealed the true scale of the organization behind the fake nanny network, before anyone could even plan their next move, a sudden, visceral instinct surged. Not from a person, but from Max. The same dog who had once been poisoned, who had growled quietly beneath dinner tables, now let out a long, piercing howl that echoed through the room like a warning. He sprang to his feet, fur bristling, eyes locked on the front door, pawing frantically at the floor as if trying to escape an unseen threat. A chill ran down Patricia's spine. One thought struck like lightning. Benjamin, her baby boy, was still at the hospital. And if what Clara had said was true, he was the final link, the living witness the organization couldn't allow to survive. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed Arthur, who was staying by their son's side. But the call rang and rang. No answer. Each tone rang like a heartbeat falling into a void, a warning that the storm had already passed through the gates. She couldn't wait another second. Grabbing her car keys, she bolted out the door with George close behind. Max, like a living arrow, leapt into the car before anyone could react. The vehicle tore through the night, slicing through the wind on the empty road leading to the central hospital. In the back seat, Max sat stiffly, alert, ears high, eyes unblinking. Patricia's hands shook on the wheel, her mind racing with the worst-case scenarios. George made repeated calls to hospital security, but every line was either busy or completely dead, as if someone had deliberately disrupted the system. Meanwhile, inside the special care unit of the hospital, Arthur sat beside Benjamin, reading a medical journal. The baby lay in an incubator, breathing steadily, his skin pink and warm after days of exhaustion. Arthur looked up when he heard knocking. 3 short taps, 2 long ones, the exact rhythm the hospital staff used. Without suspicion, he opened the door. Standing there was a doctor in a white coat, wearing a surgical mask, carrying a folder of patient files, and smiling politely. But something was wrong. His eyes weren't those of a caregiver. They were sharp, cold, and they didn't focus on Arthur. They flicked straight to the incubator where Benjamin lay. Before Arthur could react, the man pulled a syringe from the folder, already prepped. His hand tightened, aiming to move toward the baby. Arthur stepped between them, blocking the path, but before he could shout, the door behind them exploded open. Max, like a storm unleashed, launched himself at the stranger. No hesitation, no second guessing. He struck with such force that both tumbled to the floor. The syringe flew from the man's hand, rolling under the bed. The intruder cursed and raised a fist to fight back, but Max had already locked his jaws around the man's arm, his teeth, trained in special operations, clamped down with lethal precision. Arthur didn't waste a second. He slammed the emergency alarm and shouted for help. Within moments, alarms blared and footsteps pounded down the hallway. Hospital security swarmed the room and restrained the intruder before he could reach for another weapon hidden in his coat. When they pulled off his surgical mask, one nurse gasped and burst into tears. The man wasn't on staff. He was a stranger, an imposter who had infiltrated the night shift to carry out a silent kill. Later, the syringe was analyzed. It contained a powerful compound capable of triggering immediate respiratory failure in infants. Had it been injected into Benjamin, death would have come in minutes, and been ruled a post-treatment complication, a quiet, perfect death. A child erased without ever knowing why he had been targeted. But Max had not allowed that to happen. When Patricia and George finally arrived at the hospital, they found Arthur holding Benjamin tightly in his arms. Max sat beside them, blood seeping from a gash on his leg, still alert, eyes scanning the room like the battle wasn't over yet. Patricia dropped to her knees, tears falling freely as she saw her son alive. Safe. And Max, still standing guard, unshaken. She didn't need to say a word. She simply leaned down, wrapped her arms around the dog who had once been cast aside, and whispered through tears, "He's still here because of you, Max." After the attempt on baby Benjamin's life at the hospital was narrowly thwarted by Max and Arthur, a tense silence spread through the investigation team like the eye of a quiet storm. Everyone understood one chilling truth. If the organization behind Melissa had dared to strike so boldly, then their operations likely extended far beyond a single rogue agent. While the police expanded their investigation across hospital grounds, and Clara coordinated with federal security to prepare a raid on the underground data hub, a surprising source began quietly unraveling a web no one expected. A sharp-eyed little girl with an ironclad memory and a courageous heart. Bella. Inside the small guest room, where Alice had been keeping her daughter safe from the chaos outside, Bella sat, as she often did, at her desk, flipping through a thick, well-worn notebook she always brought on visits to Aunt Patricia's house. No one had known that, all this time, while the adults were preoccupied, while suspicion was still a foreign concept, Bella had been quietly observing, listening, and meticulously recording everything in her neat, rounded handwriting. Not just daily routines, but subtle oddities. The times Max barked, Melissa's strange expressions during certain phone calls, and most notably, detailed notes about strangers who came to the house under the guise of harmless service, network maintenance, child care consultation, water filter inspection. While Alice spoke on the phone with the lead investigator, Bella sat by the window, flipping through old pages. Her eyes stopped at an entry dated January 4th. A woman named Linda came, said she was from the Child Development Center. But Max barked a lot. Melissa opened the door and didn't let me near. Linda didn't look at anyone except Melissa. On the following page. January 17th. A man named Daryl wore a medical coat, came to check the water filter. Mom didn't know, but I saw he only talked to Melissa. Max barked that day, too. When Alice returned to the room, Bella looked up with unusually bright eyes and said with quiet confidence, "Mom, I think I know who worked with Melissa." Alice froze, then slowly sat beside her daughter. Bella began reading her notes aloud. Names like Linda, Daryl, Pete, a red-haired woman also named Clara, not the same one who testified, and even a young man pretending to be a delivery driver. Each one had been logged with details, physical descriptions, uniforms, the way they spoke, when they appeared, and, most importantly, Max's reactions. Alice was stunned. Bella's observations weren't just scraps. They were a surveillance log with real evidentiary value, more precise than any security footage. She immediately took photos of the journal pages and recorded Bella reading key descriptions, then forwarded everything to the investigators. Within minutes, the team responded. Daryl was a former technician fired for falsifying credentials. Linda is linked to an entity called Green Sun, suspected of laundering money through fake child wellness programs. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Most of the names Bella had listed weren't found in official employee records. These were ghosts, people who had passed through countless homes unchallenged, brought in by Melissa and her accomplices as temporary helpers or contracted consultants without ever being vetted. A 10-year-old girl, simply by listening to Max and faithfully documenting what others overlooked, had unveiled a crucial part of an elaborate impersonation network. Thanks to Bella's notebook, investigators were able to cross-reference and positively identify at least 6 individuals involved in unsolved child abduction cases, 2 of whom had once worked at the hospital where Benjamin's life had nearly been taken. Alice held her daughter close, speechless with emotion. Bella just smiled softly, resting her hand gently on Max, who lay beside the window. She whispered, "I wrote it all down because of you, Max. You helped me notice the people adults didn't see." As the list of unfamiliar personnel provided by Bella led investigators to track down and verify the false identities of individuals embedded in various households, a larger picture of the organization behind Melissa began to take shape. It wasn't just a scattered group of criminals, it was a tightly coordinated network, strategically structured, targeting upper-middle-class and affluent families. Specifically, they preyed on households with young children, limited supervision, and a reliance on domestic help. But nothing shocked the investigation team more than the next revelation brought forward by Clara, the name of the true orchestrator, the one pulling the strings behind the curtain where Melissa was merely a cog in the machine. During a confidential briefing with senior investigators, Clara pulled out a printed photo from a folder she had once hidden carefully during her time inside the organization. It was an image of a middle-aged man, calm features, thoughtful eyes, a warm, fatherly smile. The kind of face no one would suspect. Clara placed the photo on the table and said in a clear, steady voice, "This is Dr. Gordon Hale, child psychologist, featured speaker on hundreds of televised parenting seminars, and head of a well-known chain of child counseling centers across the coastal states. But he didn't just help families, he selected them." The room fell silent. An officer quickly opened a laptop and began searching for records. Almost instantly, Gordon Hale's impressive professional profile came up. Harvard Ph.D., best-selling author on child psychology, a regular guest on national educational programs, and once dubbed the man who brings parents and children closer. But behind this pristine image, Hale had turned his counseling network into a sophisticated front, using private sessions to quietly collect personal data from thousands of families every year. Under the guise of helping, he was identifying targets. Clara explained that during these sessions, Hale never took notes by hand. Instead, he used proprietary mental wellness software developed in-house by his centers. The software didn't just store information, it synced in real time to an external server, one completely separate from the national healthcare system. Through this system, variables such as household income, parents' working hours, child supervision gaps, and even emotional responses to parenting challenges were analyzed by an algorithm that generated a list of high-potential targets. On that list, Patricia and Arthur Mason, who had attended a remote webinar hosted by Hale, titled Balancing Career and Childcare, just months before Melissa was recommended to them. Gordon Hale never appeared directly in any criminal action. Every nanny, every fake technician, every so-called consultant was a pawn in his larger game. Clara confirmed, "No one in the field ever met him in person. We called him the trainer. His voice came through online training. His face appeared only in video lectures. Instructions always came from intermediaries. But everyone followed him, because he had what we feared losing most: reputation and protection." The intel was immediately escalated to federal security agencies. Hale's financial accounts were probed, revealing a trail of transactions linked to Shell caregiver services, intermediary bank accounts, and transfers to offshore destinations, all part of the same web that tied together Melissa, Reynolds, and the other imposters Bella had identified in her journal. What shattered Patricia's composure most, however, was when one of the investigators showed her a video clip retrieved from the organization's internal archives. It was footage from one of Hale's seminars. In it, he spoke with a gentle voice, eyes kind, almost paternal. "We must understand children. Let the experts help. Trust those we've trained." Then, in a compiled report titled Successfully Engaged Households, 3 names appeared: Patricia Mason, Arthur Mason, Benjamin Mason, status, file complete assigned caregiver, ML progress. Note: monitoring response to medication. Everything had become horrifyingly clear. Melissa had been the hand that executed. Gordon Hale was the mind behind it all. And Benjamin, like so many other innocent children, was just another mark, targeted by a man once hailed as a humanitarian icon in the field of childcare. After the true identity of the mastermind, Gordon Hale, was exposed, revealing the ruthless predator hidden beneath the polished mask of a respected child psychologist, federal investigators launched a nationwide crackdown. They worked in coordination with cybersecurity experts, financial crime units, and digital forensics agents, following every lead uncovered by Patricia's family, Clara, Bella, and Max. The video of Melissa deleting files, the accidental voice recording captured by Bella's phone, the meticulously handwritten journal entries penned by the child herself, and Clara's vivid, courageous testimony, all became the first bricks in an irrefutable case that would dismantle a criminal enterprise that had operated in the shadows for over a decade. The turning point came when Task Force 3, aided by Clara, raided what had been identified as the organization's underground data hub, a converted warehouse buried beneath the outskirts of Oregon. There, they uncovered an expansive server farm, protected by layers of encryption, but still storing independent backups of the data Melissa and her co-conspirators thought had been destroyed. After hours of decoding, the tech team retrieved directories containing files on nearly 1,200 families who had been monitored, over 300 of them marked as complete targets, meaning fake nannies had already been placed inside their homes. More chilling still were the hundreds of internal videos, voice memos, and training documents revealing the methodology behind the entire operation. How nannies were selected and psychologically trained, how parents were profiled and manipulated, how drug side effects were concealed, and even scripted protocols for what to do if suspicion arose. The content read like a medical training manual. Yet instead of healing, its purpose was deception and control. Even the USB drive Melissa had planted with malware to destroy evidence turned out to be her undoing. Thanks to automatic shadow copies stored on the organization's servers, something she had no idea existed, the files were almost completely recovered. Among them were full banking records used for laundering money, detailed movement logs of fake nannies across the country, and, most damning of all, a series of encrypted emails from G.H., Gordon Hale, sent to regional handlers with cold, direct instructions that left no room for denial. Federal agents executed over 70 coordinated arrests across multiple states. Among those detained were healthcare workers, licensed therapists, IT technicians, and so-called family consultants, all of whom had either directly or indirectly supported the network. Several prominent therapy centers were shut down, Hale's official website was permanently seized, and he was arrested at his home while preparing for a supposed international conference. News outlets erupted with the story, which quickly became known as the largest childcare impersonation case in U.S. history, staggering the nation with its scope, sophistication, and the shocking 12-year span of its activity. But the consequences didn't stop with the present. Thanks to Bella's logs and Clara's sworn statements, investigators reopened dozens of old child disappearance cases, once ruled as medical accidents, unexplained vanishing, or sudden cardiac arrest at home. At least 14 of those cases were now confirmed to be linked to unidentified technicians or temporary nannies, ghost names that left no paper trail yet matched entries in the organization's hidden roster, now exposed through the efforts of a dog and a child. Patricia, Arthur, and their family were no longer just survivors. They had become key witnesses, the human heart at the center of a victory over one of the most callous and calculating criminal systems in recent memory. And in the place where it had all begun, the home once targeted as a perfect match by the network, Max now lay peacefully beside Benjamin, who slept quietly in his crib. His eyes were no longer sharp with vigilance but soft with comfort, as if he knew that after everything, the storm had passed, and this house was finally safe again. After the fake nanny network was finally dismantled and the masterminds, Gordon Hale among them, were arrested and exposed, it seemed justice had prevailed. However, for Patricia and Alice, two mothers who had lived through weeks of fear, nearly losing their sons and nieces, true peace only came when society began to acknowledge how fragile even the safest-looking homes could be. The question that haunted them in the aftermath was not, "Why did this happen to us?" but rather, how many more families are living this without even knowing it? With that mindset, they refused to remain victims. Instead, they became leaders in a nationwide push for reform in the system meant to protect children at home. Starting with the very thing most often overlooked, background checks on caregivers. With their credibility in the medical field and a quiet, determined resolve, Patricia and Alice swiftly built bridges with child advocacy organizations, lawmakers, and regulatory agencies. Together, they proposed a detailed petition titled, "Trust Cannot Be Built on Paper Alone." In it, they demanded a three-tiered vetting process for hiring nannies and in-home caregivers, comprehensive identity and criminal background checks, psychological evaluations by independent professionals, and mandatory monitoring during trial periods via discreet surveillance or anonymous spot checks. They also called for a national open-source platform for parents to rate, report, and review caregiving services, shattering the wall of silence that predators had long relied on to operate undetected. At first, the proposal sparked backlash over privacy concerns, but once the details of the case became public, once the story of little Benjamin, Max, and Patricia's miraculous family spread across media and parenting forums, millions of parents signed in support within days. The groundswell of public pressure, combined with undeniable evidence, pushed Congress to fast-track the 2025 Child Home Safety Act. For the first time in U.S. history, the law required all nannies, babysitters, home aides, and child consultants to register through a federal screening system, not only for credentials, but also for behavioral red flags, financial transparency, and verified employment history. It also held all staffing agencies legally accountable for any harm caused by individuals they failed to vet properly. Beyond legislation, Patricia partnered with the National Pediatrics Association to co-develop a toolkit for early detection of child abuse, designed so that even non-expert parents could recognize subtle behavioral, verbal, and emotional changes in their children. Meanwhile, Alice used her growing parent network to organize dozens of free community workshops, teaching families how to ask the right questions, run anonymous checks, and most importantly, empower children to recognize and speak up when something feels wrong. Alongside their work, Dr. Rachel, the veterinarian who first suspected Melissa's behavior and helped save Max from poisoning, launched a passion project titled Guardians on Pause. The initiative aimed to train dogs to detect abusive behavior in domestic settings based on Max's real-life instincts. Backed by the Department of Justice and Department of Agriculture, Rachel and her team opened the first canine training center in California, where dogs were specifically taught to pick up on distress signals, from unusual infant crying to the scent of strange medications to hormonal cues of aggressive intent in adults. Despite his age and the lingering injury from the hospital attack, Max became the center's first instructor. His loyalty, protective instinct, and tireless vigilance were integrated into the official training curriculum, inspiring an entire generation of protection dogs. Hundreds of families soon enrolled in the program to train their dogs as trusted guardians for young children, launching a whole new approach to home abuse prevention. Each week, Patricia received letters from mothers across the country, sharing how they'd spotted red flags thanks to her guidance. Alice ran the fast-growing community forum, The Mother Wall, where thousands of families exchanged real-world stories to protect one another from imposters. Rachel kept posting regular updates from the training program. And Max, the dog once dismissed as too old and too slow to be useful, was now the national symbol for child safety through companion animals. The horrific events of that year would never fully erase the pain they endured, but they became the foundation for something far greater, a cultural awakening, a real structural reform, and a stronger, more vigilant community, where children were no longer left alone behind paper credentials and well-rehearsed smiles. After the long battle against the nanny impersonation ring finally ended and the shadows of fear and loss began to fade, Patricia, Arthur, and Benjamin were at last able to breathe and look toward the future. Though justice had been served, the scars, both visible and invisible, ran deep. For that reason, they chose not to return to the house that had once been violated, where every corner whispered memories of hidden cameras and a child's lonely cries. Instead, they moved to a quieter neighborhood, one filled with trees, warm sunlight, and most importantly, a sense of beginning anew with greater strength and deeper resolve. Their new home was nestled in a small, peaceful community just a few blocks away from Alice and Mr. George, close enough to stay connected to the people who had stood with them through the darkest days, but distant enough to let go of haunting memories. The house had a wide yard, a sunlit porch, and a special little room just for Max. Not a crate, not a corner, but a real watch room, complete with a soft bed, toys, and a wooden sign above the door that read, "This is the home of Hero Max." Since Max's courageous actions had come to light, the community's outpouring of gratitude never ceased. The city held a special ceremony in the town square, awarding Max the Canine Bravery Medal, a rare honor given only to animals who had saved human lives. News stations covered his story, children drew pictures of him, and one television channel even created a short animated film about Max's journey, portraying him as a silent guide who protected children from dangers invisible to adults. But for Max, no medal mattered more than waking up each morning to Benjamin crawling out of bed to wrap his little arms around his neck, whispering secrets only the two of them could understand. Ever since the night Max saved him, Benjamin hadn't left his side. His first steps, his first laughs, his first clumsy words, they were all shared with his shaggy companion. Even at preschool, Benjamin carried a small photo of Max in his backpack, as if it were his talisman, a symbol of safety words could never quite capture. To him, Max wasn't just a dog. Max was childhood itself, warm, unwavering, and always nearby. Patricia and Arthur also found a new rhythm in life. They adjusted their work schedules to spend more time with Benjamin, participated in public forums about child safety, and often shared their story, not just about listening to their child's voice, but about learning to hear what couldn't be spoken, especially from those who don't have a human language. At these events, Patricia always carried a photo of Benjamin napping with Max curled beside him, a peaceful image that quietly healed whatever pain remained. George, the once nosy neighbor now hailed as a local hero, became a trusted safety advisor for families in the community. He'd often joke with Max during visits, "You've done more for justice than I did in my whole police career." And Max would respond with nothing but a calm wag of his tail and that knowing look, as if to say he knew he had fulfilled his mission. and was still ready if darkness ever returned. As for Rachel, the vet who had saved Max from poisoning and helped expose the plot, she continued expanding the Paw Guard initiative, using Max as the role model for her special household protection dog training program. Each graduating dog received a small badge engraved with Max's likeness, a legacy passed from one guardian to the next. Though Max had grown older, he was still regularly invited to attend training sessions as an honorary coach, lying calmly in the middle of the field, watching younger dogs practice, occasionally offering a soft bark like a wise elder sharing silent advice. Time passed. Patricia's hair began to silver. Benjamin grew into a bright schoolboy, and Alice opened a community center to help parents spot early warning signs. Max, though his steps were slower now, still made his morning rounds in the garden, still lay beside Benjamin's bed whenever he napped, and still gave a low growl when strangers passed too close to the gate. In the end, the greatest thing Max left behind wasn't the medal, or the headlines, or even the films made in his honor. It was the feeling of absolute safety, a kind no security camera could offer, no training manual could teach. He was a silent guardian, a living memory in the hearts of the Mason family, an enduring symbol of loyalty, love, and watchfulness, values that never go out of date when it comes to parenthood. And even as time moves on, even when Benjamin grows up and leaves the nest, the story of Max, the dog who quietly protected a family through the storm of evil, will always be told. A gentle legend passed down in bedtime whispers to children, that sometimes the one who saves you isn't the loudest hero in the room, but the one who never leaves your side when the world goes dark. The story of Max, the loyal dog who courageously uncovered a sinister network to protect a little boy, is more than just emotional. It reminds us that love and vigilance often come from the quietest places. In a world full of hidden dangers, do you believe a small animal could be a hero, just like Max was? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed something in your pet that made you see them differently? If this story touched your heart or gave you hope, don't forget to like it, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel for more meaningful and moving stories like this. We'll see you in the next journey, where love, trust, and courage always win.